Ever since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, low morale has proven to be a big problem for Vladimir Putin's armies. It's such a problem that the commander of Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army, Major General Ivan Ivanovich Popov, was dismissed from his post for pointing it out in July 2023. Poor logistics, command structure, insufficient troop rotation, and a war seemingly without end have plagued Russia's armies since the war began, and given Russian soldiers little relief from the stressful demands of the battlefield. The morale problem has gotten so bad that there are now reports of Russia's soldiers suffering from a widespread mental health crisis. However, Ukrainian troops, despite their higher morale, are also suffering from severe mental stress. In this video, we will look at the contributors to the low morale of Russian forces in Ukraine, how Ukrainian forces are also suffering, and what it could mean for the war as it moves into its third year. Since ancient times, morale has been one of the most important components of warfare. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu mentioned that the moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. It was the first of 7 factors by which he claimed he could predict victory or defeat. Napoleon also famously mentioned morale's importance in warfare, noting that it was much more important in determining the outcome of a conflict than the physical factors on the battlefield. Perhaps the most famous example of the importance of morale occurred in the 100 Years' War between England and France. In 1429, the French cause looked lost and the victory of the English inevitable. But the sudden arrival of Joan of Arc, who lifted the siege of Orleans in a few weeks, completely reversed the situation. French forces believed in themselves again, and within months had gained an advantage in the war that they would not lose from that point forward. Such is the power of morale in warfare. It's proven to be no different in Ukraine. From the start, Ukrainian forces have had better morale than their Russian adversaries. This was another major shock that experts did not expect when the invasion began. If Russia was good at one thing before the war, it was propaganda. Many international observers feared its large and supposedly modern military. By consensus, the Russian armed forces were considered the world's second most capable. This supposed modernity extended much further than weapons or tactics, but in recruitment and quality of personnel. Just before its collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union had an active army of about 3.5 million men. However, while this fighting force may have had mass, it was also unwieldy. It was largely composed of conscripted soldiers and lacked experienced, non-commissioned officers. The end of the Soviet Union brought changes to the Russian military. It shrank to about 35% of the size of the former Soviet armed forces. However, the reduction in size supposedly came with an upgrade in quality. The Russian army moved away from conscript forces and toward regular, professional soldiers. Russia's forces were also organized into more compact units, with fighting in Ukraine in 2014 and Syria from 2015 being done mostly at the company level. The reorganization and professionalization of the post-Soviet army should have produced units of veteran troops with experience fighting together, increasing their morale. This supposedly fearsome fighting force was bearing down on Ukraine, a country which was already divided along ethnic and linguistic lines, with many Russian-speaking people in its eastern oblasts. In some ways, it is understandable why Vladimir Putin bought into his own hype and believed his troops would be greeted as liberators by many people in Ukraine. Instead, almost the entirety of Ukraine, minus the long-standing separatist areas in Donetsk and Luhansk, united in the face of the Russian invasion. Ukrainian soldiers were fighting in the knowledge that they would be defending their homes, their families, and their fellow citizens. Meanwhile, Russia's troops, despite a higher level of company experience, lacked experienced soldiers operating at the division or corps level needed to conduct something like the invasion of Ukraine. To further complicate matters, Russia's armed forces are a polyglot grouping, and different units are set up to confront different threats. Russia is the world's largest country by land area and spans 11 time zones. Troops in the west are trained to guard against NATO, while troops in the east guard a vast wilderness and the Chinese border. Integrating these diverse forces into a cohesive whole has proven challenging. Further complicating matters has been the integration of forces from Russia's National Guard, the separatist Donetsk and Luhansk areas, and, until the summer of 2023, Wagner mercenaries. Even riot police, which are not trained for combat, have been deployed to the front in Ukraine. These diverse units have often been trained on different equipment as well, making integration even more difficult. These problems are not unlike those faced by many vast empires in history, which have tried to invade a smaller neighbor. In these conflicts, the large heterogeneous empire can struggle to cohesively manage its forces, with soldiers that struggle to figure out their reason for being deployed to the war. Meanwhile, the smaller state with more compact and cohesive forces often see its troops fight with more determination. We've seen this play out in Ukraine. However, this age-old dynamic is far from the only reason why Russia has experienced widespread morale problems. Inadequate training and equipment also play a big part. Russia has even had a problem supplying its troops with food. Early in the war, the New York Times reported that Russian troops were carrying rations that had expired in 2002. Russian troops were often short of fuel as well, which was one of the reasons why a 64-kilometer-long convoy stalled at the Kyiv front in March 2022. Russian forces often sabotaged their own vehicles so that they would not need to fight. Ukrainian soldiers took advantage of this and inflicted heavy casualties on the invaders, reducing morale even further. Russian soldiers have had difficulty communicating with their families back home, which puts added stress on the home front's morale. In those early days, reports swirled of grandmothers, mothers, sisters, wives, and girlfriends not even realizing that their loved ones were in Ukraine until the war started. Once the war began, the Kremlin began a new wave of censorship, making communications between home and the front lines even more difficult. New laws passed since the war began have been increasingly repressive, and almost 20,000 people were detained for demonstrating against the war by the end of 2022. 45% of the detainees were women seeking answers about the fate of their loved ones. In the early days of the war, morale problems extended to some of the units that had fought in Ukraine and rotated out. A report for The Guardian covered one unit once stationed in the Russian Far East prior to the war, which had seen action in the Battle of Kyiv. Soldiers from this unit refused to be deployed back into Ukraine from their base in Belgorod. These soldiers had a loophole to exploit. Because the war in Ukraine is not classified as a war in Russia, but rather a special military operation, these soldiers on Russian territory could not be punished with prison time. Loopholes also extended to compensation for wounded soldiers. According to The Guardian's report, one wounded junior sergeant was supposed to be given a pension of about $3,100. His superiors argued that because he was injured in a Ukrainian attack on Russian border territory and not in Ukraine itself, he was not entitled to the pension. These administrative issues have taken their toll on Russian morale since the start of the war. Russian morale problems in Ukraine magnified in the summer and autumn of 2022. At this time, Ukrainian forces were beating the invaders back in their successful offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts. Ukrainian units were making rapid gains, and Russian forces were routed across thousands of square kilometers of territory. As early as July of that year, British defense officials were reporting cases of entire Russian units refusing to fight, with armed standoffs between soldiers and their officers. Heavy casualties were reported as one of the contributors to the morale problem, a contributor which intensified in the face of Ukraine's successful northern and southern campaigns. British officials noted at the time that many of the Russian soldiers did not understand their reason for being in Ukraine. To cope with the collapsing morale at the front and to mitigate the shortage of manpower in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin announced a wave of mobilization in October 2022. 300,000 troops were called to the ranks. The first result that this order had was to prompt a mass exodus. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men, often among the country's more highly educated, fled the country to avoid military service. IT specialists and artists were among those who left Russia in disproportionately high numbers. The men avoiding conscription fled to border countries, even including Mongolia. In response, Putin presented a bold face to the public, saying that it was a good thing that traitors were leaving the country. He described the phenomenon as self-cleansing. Putin also allowed thousands of prisoners to be recruited into the Wagner Group, and later Russia's regular army, from Russian prisons as a way to make up for the manpower shortfall. However, the arrival of both these new types of soldier only made Russia's morale problem worse. These soldiers were often mistreated, used as cannon fodder, and not given proper care. When speaking to CNN, one of the convict soldiers mentioned that he and his comrades had injuries which were not being operated on. The convict soldier said that things were so bad that people were walking around the hospital with shrapnel stuck in their legs. One convict soldier, who recorded an audio message released by CNN, claimed that the Russian military wanted him and his comrades to die. The soldiers in the regular Russian army have often mistreated the convicts and mobilized soldiers in other ways. stealing their belongings, and forcing them to fight at the front of the line so they will be the ones to become casualties first. The treatment of the mobilized and prisoner soldiers dovetailed with the contribution of logistical problems to poor morale. Corrupt Russian logistics officers have long had a habit of acquiring and selling military gear for their private profit. This culture of corruption has contributed to the equipment and morale problems seen in the Russian ranks. For example, Russian logistics officers have often sold off whole or partial body armor sets, often leaving the soldiers in Ukraine without proper body armor. Once the ill-prepared conscripts were called up toward the end of 22, the situation at the front got so bad that soldiers were complaining that they had been issued the airsoft version of the Ratnik body armor. Insufficient body armor is one of the reasons why Russia has suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties in Ukraine. Morale in the Russian High Command also started to deteriorate in late 2022 and early 2023. This was the time when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, intensified his criticism of Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. The criticisms eventually resulted in the Wagner Rebellion at the end of June 2023, which saw the mutinous mercenary group take the city of Rostov-on-Don and get to within 120 miles of Moscow. Prigozhin's complaints included accusations that his men were suffering from poor supplies and even attacks from Russia's regular army, because Shoigu and Gerasimov had it in for him. The Institute for the Study of War could not independently verify the more sensationalist claims, but Wagner did suffer a shortage of artillery shells during the long battle for Bakhmut, which was one of the reasons why it took such heavy casualties there. One of the biggest reasons for Russia's morale problems, one which affects all of its troops in Ukraine, is poor unit rotation. Russian troops have been posted at the front lines seemingly without end. In June 2023, a RAND Corporation report suggested that the mobilized soldiers from the autumn of 2022 had not been allowed to leave the military since they were drafted into it. To make matters worse, none would be allowed to leave service until the period of partial mobilization is ended by another decree from Putin. According to the RAND report, the only ways out of the Russian military for these mobilized soldiers, aside from death in combat, are reaching the mandatory retirement age, imprisonment, or medical discharge. The RAND report anticipated comments made in September from the Russian State Duma Defense Committee chairman, Andrei Kotapolov. He stated that the mobilized soldiers would stay in combat zones in Ukraine until the special military operation was complete. In recent campaigning in Zaporizhia Oblast, Ukrainian sources reported that Russian troops fighting near Robotyne were doing so without rotation or reinforcements. Many of these troops had been on the front lines since Ukraine started its offensive operations in Zaporizhia in June. Russian military bloggers frequently complained about extended stays on the front line, and the Institute for the Study of War also assessed that troops in the area had been fighting without rotation or reinforcement since the start of the campaign. The lack of rotation in the war is not new. Ukrainian troops have suffered too. In late 2022, reports of Ukraine's difficulties in rotating its units from the front began to circulate. Ukrainian troops have often been forced to stay in combat for weeks with no relief. Despite the high motivation of Ukraine's troops, psychologists pointed out that combat capability could only be maintained for 40 days. From then on, the ability to make decisions will decrease due to combat fatigue, according to these experts. However, Ukrainian troops pointed out that they had spent over 90 days on the front line without rotation. The BBC reported that Ukrainian troops in one unit, the 24th Mechanized Brigade in Donbass, had only 10 days leave during the entirety of 2022. The war has also done significant damage to the mental health of the entire country. According to a February 2023 report by the World Health Organization, nearly 10 million Ukrainians are suffering from mental health issues, such as depression or anxiety, and the government of Ukraine admitted that 60% of its soldiers were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Nevertheless, Russia's forces have had it worse when it comes to unit rotation. The lack of unit rotation is one of the reasons that Russia has been unable to implement its military recommendations on the employment of equipment and application of formations. This assessment by the Royal United Services Institute may explain why Russia has taken disproportionate casualties in Zaporizhia. In July, the Institute for the Study of War mentioned that Russian defenses in that area, despite being extensive, were also brittle. ISW concluded, partially as a result of General Popov's comments and dismissal, the Russian forces lacked the amount of reserve units required to keep their frontline units in proper rotation. The result was that all of the units manning the fortifications had inadequate rest. These reports were strengthened by the later fighting at Robotyne, where exhausted Russian forces struggled to halt the advance of Ukrainian units, which have now breached the first and second lines of their enemy's formidable defensive network in Zaporizhia. The reports suggest that if Russia's defensive lines had not been as extensive, Ukrainian forces would have made even more rapid gains. Ukraine's troops have taken some psychological blows as a result of their unrelenting deployment, but Russian forces have reportedly been suffering from a full-blown, widespread mental health crisis. In commentary on the Times Radio, retired Major General Clip Chapman noted that historically, a person can fight for a maximum between 70 and 100 days at a time before they wind up in a catatonic state. Such mental exhaustion is why rotating units and allowing soldiers to rest is critical for the ability of a fighting force to remain effective through the conflict. Chapman said that this has been a problem, particularly for the Russians. He was commenting on British intelligence reports about the mental state of Russian forces. In October 2023, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense released intelligence from December 2022, showing that 100,000 Russian military personnel were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, according to that country's own psychologists. The failure to provide adequate rotation and rest from battle contributed greatly to this problem. The UK MOD's report also mentioned that Russian doctors are looking the other way, sending soldiers who are unfit to fight back to the front. These reports would dovetail with the lack of adequate medical care given to the soldiers recruited from Russian prisons. But the UK MOD's report assessed that mental health services were just as bad as the physical ones. These circumstances suggest that medical discharges of any kind in the Russian military are rare. Substance abuse problems have been reported among Russian troops. Drug-related cases have been increasing in Russia's military courts. This phenomenon came partially because of the wave of mobilization, which did not properly screen those called to the colors for drug addiction. Sources in the Russian military have reported that soldiers who have had the fortune of leaving the front line for rest have found it easy to buy drugs in cities like Donetsk, which has long been under the control of Russia or pro-Russian separatists. Soldiers who have managed to return to the Russian homeland have also been reportedly using drugs at elevated rates. According to official Russian statistics, the use of synthetic amphetamines like mephedrone, called salt in Russia, has been on the rise. Criminal cases related to this drug have also been on the rise in multiple regions in Russia, including Moscow. Most of the cases are trafficking related. The report on the subject from Radio Free Europe cautioned that it would take a year or two before a drug crisis in the Russian ranks can be confirmed, but public health specialists who spoke with the organization anonymously were concerned about what they were seeing. One doctor in the Rostov area said in the report, "The Defense Ministry has a whole department for psychological rehabilitation, but no real work for the large-scale treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder is being done. When a person sees all the horrors and filth of war, limbs ripped off, open wounds, death, a lot of them will try to mute them with drink and drugs. Otherwise, they would just go mad." Russia's lack of adequate unit rotation, poor supplies, censorship of communication, and corrupt officers might be forcing soldiers to deal with their mental health problems in another way. Mental health crises in armies is a phenomenon as old as war itself, but Russia's command structure and lack of clear reasons for fighting in Ukraine have exacerbated this issue, even as its Ukrainian enemy is also suffering severely. As the war drags on into its third year with still no end in sight, Russian morale problems may prove an X factor that grows in importance as Ukraine seeks victory, albeit on a slow and painful road. It would not be the first time in Russian history that a collapse in morale on the battlefield or the home front proves a decisive factor in one of its conflicts. But will history repeat itself? What do you think about the state of morale in both the Russian and Ukrainian armies? Don't forget to let us know in the comments section. Also remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.